Well, good morning. I hope this Lord's Day finds everybody doing well. For our sermon this morning, I'd like for us to look at a theme that runs in many ways all throughout the Bible. Of course, there are several themes that can be said to run throughout the Bible. And I think it is often useful for us to see those themes, those larger threads, as it were, because these are the things that, at least in my experience, help us to understand some of the smaller pieces that we read about in the Bible. It's very easy to get caught up in the details of stories sometimes and not understand what that story is really about. Jared, of course, has recently given us a series of lessons on some major themes in the Bible. And in sort of that same spirit, I'd like for us to think about a major theme in the Bible together for a few minutes this morning. Of course, there are many of these major themes, but perhaps what they all have in common is that all of them, in one way or another, are pointing forward. All of them were examples or types or illustrations of something that was to come, something much larger than these examples themselves that is ultimately fulfilled even now in the lives that you and I are living in Christ Jesus. One of these biblical themes is the theme of exile. There are several ways that we could go about exploring the theme of exile. It's one of those themes that as you look at it, you find that it really is mentioned over and over, just dozens and dozens of times in the Bible. And it appears in all kinds of biblical stories. You may remember that on occasion, as we've gone through the Gospel of John on Wednesday nights, that I've mentioned that this thing in the life of Jesus that John talks about is really a reference to the exile of Israel and Jesus' response to that. And so, what I'd like for us to do is look at this theme of exile. There are several ways that we could tackle a theme that is this large, but I'm going to take a particular approach today that I hope will help us to see what it has to do with us. The approach that I'm going to take is basically to point out that there are two kinds of exile, basically, generally speaking, that are mentioned or illustrated in the Bible. And the first one is, of course, when God drives people out. This is something that happens over and over again. The very first time we see it is, of course, in the book of Genesis, and the very first story of the Bible, the creation of man and the world and man's sin against God. Here there is a precedent that is set where we see that as Adam sins, that God drives Adam out of the garden. And this becomes a model for God's behavior and God's reaction to sin throughout the Bible. That God drives sinners away from himself because he is a holy God. He is a pure God, morally and every other way. And he cannot have fellowship or relationship with those who are defiled and rebellious and who are wicked. And so when Adam decides that he's not going to follow God's command, God sends him out of the garden. In Genesis 3 and verse 24, it says that God drove the man out. And remember, it says there that God placed at the east of the garden the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. And so Adam is forced out of the place that God had made for him. Remember that God had said to him earlier in chapter 3 that by the sweat of your face you will earn your living from this day forward. And the earth was cursed. And so Adam is driven out of the garden, out of the place where there was life and water and plenteous food and easy living, into a life of hardship, ultimately into a world cursed by his own sin and a world where Adam would die. And so this kind of sets the stage for the way that God acts over and over again. We read about it again, for example, the next time in the Bible, in the people of Babel, And you remember that famous story that the people were building a tower to heaven. And there's perhaps a couple different ways to kind of think about what it was that was uh, displeasing to God about what they did. That's really not our point here today. However, we understand the nature of that sin. The Bible makes it very clear that God was highly displeased with these people, that they had sinned against him, that there was an arrogance that was involved here. And God does to them what he did to Adam. It says that the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth. And so we see this picture repeated, that the people sin and they are driven out of the place where they were, just like Adam had been driven out. And the text goes on to even repeat this, possibly for emphasis in verse 9, that from there the Lord scattered them abroad. We also read, of course, perhaps even more familiar to us, the scattering of the Canaanites out of the land of Canaan, out of Palestine. You may remember, as we've talked about in previous lessons, that the way that the land of Canaan is described is very reminiscent of the garden. It is a place that is well watered. It is a place where food grows in abundance. It is a place that flows with milk and honey, a place where it is easy to live, like the garden was. And it is made for God's people to live there. And God, like he brought Adam to the garden, he brings Israel there. The Canaanites had been living in that land, and just as Adam had sinned and was driven out of God's land, so the Canaanites had sinned against God, and God drove them out too. You remember in Exodus 23, before Israel left Egypt, God said, here's what's going to happen. I will send hornets ahead of you that they will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. I will not drive them out before you in a single year. I will drive them out before you little by little, and then finally you will drive them out as they pick up the sword and fight. And so here, obviously, the Canaanites are being driven out of the land because of their sin. Remember way back in the book of Genesis that God had told Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorite was not yet full or not yet complete. But when they had reached the point where God would not tolerate their sinfulness anymore, God would drive the Canaanites out and give this land to his people. And that's what was going on here as God was speaking in Exodus 23. There are several references to this in the Old Testament. Over and over, we hear about God driving out the Canaanites. And so God says, I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Deuteronomy 33, he drove out the enemy from before you. And Moses there recounting what God had done for his people up to that point. Over and over again, this is mentioned in the Bible that God drove the Canaanites out of Palestine because of their sin. Also, however, perhaps the most well-known example to us students of the Bible is God driving Israel out of the land as well. Israel wound up walking in the footsteps of their forefather Adam. That just like God had created Adam and put him into this beautiful place that was full of life for them, so God had created Israel, created them from a woman who was barren, from a string of women who were barren. And God made them come from nothing, as it were, from Abraham and Sarah and the generations after that, and made them a great people, and then brought them and put them into this beautiful land. And yet, like Adam, the prophet says in the Old Testament, they transgressed God's covenant. They did not do what God told them to do. And their sin piled up and piled up until the point where God drove them out of the land of Canaan, just like God drove Adam out of the garden. God says in Hosea 9 and verse 15, all their evil is at Gilgal. Indeed, I came to hate them there because of the wickedness of their deeds. I will drive them out of my house. The word translated here, drive them out, is the same word that is used there in Genesis 3 and verse 24 of Adam being taken out of the garden. Over and over, there are biblical references to Israel's exile. In Isaiah 59 in verses 1 and 2, of course, you remember that God is explaining to Israel why they were in exile. He says that it's not that the Lord's arm is so short that it cannot deliver, but your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God. Just as the Canaanites had to be driven out and Adam had to be driven out because of their sin, so it was Israel's sin that caused them to be driven out of the place where they were. We hear hints of this in the story of the kings as Israel's history goes on, and ultimately the time comes for them to be evicted from the land. In 2 Kings 16, Ahaz walked in the way of the kings of Israel and even made his sons pass through the fire, just like the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the sons of Israel. It is very obvious as you're reading up to that point in the story what's about to happen, that they were acting just like the Canaanites, and so what God did to the Canaanites, he would then do to the Israelites as well. In 2 Kings 17, they burned incense on all the high places, like the nations did which the Lord carried away to exile before them. And so Israel once again copied the sinful actions of the sinners who had gone before them. And so we're told in 1 Chronicles 9 that Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. Just like Adam, just like the Canaanites had sinned, so Israel sinned as well and was driven out of the land. That's one kind of exile that we read about in the Bible, where God drives people out because they are sinners. But there's another kind of driving out or exile that is described in the Bible, and it's almost the opposite. It is when men drive people away from their company. And when the world drives people out, it is not because of their sin, it is because of their righteousness. Whereas God drives the wicked away from himself, the world drives the righteous away from itself. There are several examples of this in the Bible, several of which I've chosen here to share with you by way of reminder. But Moses and Aaron in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 11 had been speaking to Pharaoh. And remember, hard-hearted Pharaoh would not listen. And it says that Moses and Aaron were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. Interestingly, it is the same word again that is used of what God did to Adam and to the Canaanites and to the Israelites. But here, man is driving out not sinners, but righteous men from their company. We read it in the story of Jephthah, that Gilead's wife bore him sons, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephthah out. Now, I don't believe that Jephthah is called in this passage a righteous man, but he is remembered in the Bible in Hebrews and places like that for his faith. He does get recognized as a man of faith. And so here is this man who has this spirit of godliness about him, at least to some extent, and even his own brothers drive him away because they do not want him in the family. David is perhaps a great example of this as well. In 1 Samuel chapter 26, David is pleading with Saul. He says, listen, if God wants me gone, that's fine. But if it is men who are doing this, cursed are they before the Lord, for they have driven me out so that I would have no attachment with the inheritance of the Lord. And you may remember also the story in David's life where Absalom stages the rebellion, and David is driven out of Jerusalem, his own capital, where he has to go and run from the presence of the son who wants to destroy him and take his kingdom. So David becomes a man who is driven out as well. All of these men, and perhaps others in the Bible we could think of as well, have something interesting in common. That they are actually men who were God's appointed rescuers. You think about this list of people that we have just looked at here. We've got David, the king of Israel, the great man after God's own heart. Of course, he wasn't perfect, as the biblical story explains very well. But there was something about David, his faith, his love for God, his loyalty to God, that earned him a special place in God's heart. And it was his line that would be the reason that Judah would last as long as it did. David was a great leader of men spiritually and brought the nation to God in a way that no other king had done. Or you think about Jephthah, the great conqueror, the judge of God's people. Or you think about Moses, who had been sent to lead God's people out, and yet he was rejected, sometimes even by his own people, and certainly by people of Egypt. And so there is this kind of history that God sends rescuers. He sends leaders to go and bring people to himself. And those leaders, those rescuers, are themselves rejected by the world. And so those are the two kinds of exile that we read about in the Bible, the kind that God does and the kind that man does. And both of them, of course, end up with the same result, that there is a separation that takes place, that people are ostracized from the place that they need to be. Whereas man needs to be with God, he can't. And whereas the righteous need to be among those who need rescuing, they are driven out and can't be there. And so at this point, we might pause and start to think about perhaps how we fit into this story. Because as we think about God driving Adam out of the garden, or driving the Canaanites or the people of Babel out of their place, or driving Israel out of their land, we have to understand that all of this was a model, an illustration, or a type of something far greater. And that something is our situation. Because the fact is that we have come to share in this very difficulty as well. That like Adam and Israel, we have been driven into exile, that we have been driven apart from God by our sin. You remember what Paul says in Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 3, that you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Language there that is faintly reminiscent of the story of Adam, where God told Adam that in the day you eat of the forbidden fruit, you will die. So we, like Israel, have walked in the footsteps of Adam. And because we have transgressed, we have become dead. These are the trespasses in which we formerly walked, Paul said, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience, the same spirit and attitude that sinners have. Among them too we all formerly lived in the lusts of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and like everybody else, we became children of wrath. Just like Adam, just like the Canaanites, just like the people of Babel, just like the Israelites, that we wound up in exile as well. Now, of course, we have not been kicked out of our country. We have not been kicked out of our homeland like the people of Babel or the Canaanites or the Israelites were, or Adam was. But all of that was a physical illustration of what has happened to us spiritually. that our sin has caused us to go into exile from God spiritually, that it has caused an estrangement, that it has caused a separation. And the words of Isaiah to Israel, that your sin has separated between you and your God, is just as true of us as it was of Israel. That because we have sinned, that we cannot have fellowship with this holy God. The text also says in Colossians chapter 1 and verse 21 that although you were formerly alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds. That's a description of all of us, and especially us in that context who are not Jewish but Gentiles, that we were alienated from God. That's another way of talking about exile. And so whether we're talking about Adam, whether we're talking about Israel, whether we're talking about ourselves, the picture in the Bible is that exile has become the condition of all humanity, that all have sinned. And because all of us have sinned, God has done with us what he did with Adam, what he did with the Canaanites, and what he did with Israel, that he has sent us into exile, that we have been cut off from God to live in a land and a world that is cursed by our own sin, where we will live in hardship and ultimately face death. The big biblical question, therefore, is there a way back? Is there a way that those who have been exiled may ever return to God? And the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that Jesus has come to end the exile, that he is the solution to the problem of estrangement and of alienation and of exile away from the presence of God. We noted that there are two kinds of exile in the Bible: when God sends people away who are sinners, and when wicked people send the righteous away because they are righteous. Well, Jesus fits in that second category as well. That like Moses, like Jephthah, like David, and like others, that he was rejected by the world because he was righteous. Jesus kind of summarized this in Matthew 21 when Jesus asked the famous question, "Did you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected? This became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Of course, Jesus is that stone, rejected by the people that he was sent to save, and yet he has become the chief cornerstone in the new temple, the new fellowship of God. And so Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of this story of how the world rejects or exiles the righteous that is sent. But the great thing about the story of Jesus is that this rejected one has come and he has brought about the reconciliation. He has ended the exile of all who wish to come back to God. He gathers the faithful of Israel. Over and over we hear this in the Bible. In Isaiah chapter 11 and in verse 12, we hear the prophecy that he will lift up a standard for the nations and assemble the banished ones of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And so here we have lifting up a standard for not only the Gentiles, we'll come to that in just a moment, but especially the ones of Israel and Judah. And what's interesting is that in this particular context in the book of Isaiah, this is the context that begins this way. A shoot will spring from the branch of Jesse. A branch from his roots will bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. And it goes on to talk about what you and I understand to be a beautiful description of Jesus himself, that he is from the root of Jesse, the Davidic line, and he will bring about this great condition in which he will gather together those of the Jewish people, the Israelites, who want to be gathered back to God. And so this is that context in which it says that the Lord will recover the remnant of his people in verse 11, and he will lift up a standard, a signal, which we ultimately understand to be the cross of Jesus Christ, so that those among Israel who wanted to return to God could return through him. In Jeremiah chapter 31, behold, I am bringing them from the north country and will gather them from the remote parts of the earth. You may recognize the reference there in Jeremiah chapter 31, that this is the text that goes on to say that days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, and I will put my law within them and write it on their hearts. This is, of course, fulfilled in the work of Jesus, who establishes that new covenant, so that those among the Israelites who want to be reconciled to God and come out of their exile in sin may do so. But Jesus also gathers believing Gentiles to God. In Amos chapter 9, in that day, kind of a code word for the Messianic age, God says, I will raise up the fallen booth of David and wall up its breaches. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old. And this is a reference, of course, to God restoring the Davidic kingdom. And they may possess the remnant of Edom. Not only they, that is the people of God, the Israelites, but also and all the nations, all the Gentiles who are called by my name. This is the passage that James quotes in Acts chapter 15 as he was answering the question, can Gentiles be part of the church? He quoted this passage to say yes, that is what God is doing, that God is bringing the Gentiles to himself, bringing them out of the exile of sin in the gospel. In Isaiah 56 and verse 8, the Lord God who gathers the dispersed of Israel declares, yet others I will gather to them. Back there in Isaiah chapter 11, in the passage where we were just talking about the Israelites and the people of Judah being gathered together to the Lord again, we hear in that very text in verse 10, in that day the nations, the Gentiles, will resort to the root of Jesse. The root of Jesse, who was identified in verse 1, the descendant of David, who is, of course, Jesus. And so God said that not only would he gather all of the Israelites who wanted to come back to him, but he would also gather the Gentiles who wanted to come out of their exile of sin and come back to the Lord as well. Of course, Jesus does this by dying for the sins of both the Jews and the Gentiles and reconciling them to God. You remember in John chapter 11 that the high priest, perhaps and almost certainly not realizing, recognized and prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. It is this scenario that Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. That God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, like Adam, like the Canaanites, like Israel, that Christ died for us. Much more than now, having been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. That's the language of the end of exile. If exile is estrangement, then what Jesus has done is ended the exile. He has brought us out of the place of isolation from God And we have now been reconciled through the death of his Son, and much more now, having been reconciled, will be saved by his life. There is one more application of this that I would suggest before we end the lesson this morning. Remember, we said that Jesus enters into that second kind of exile, that he was not exiled because of his sin, he was exiled by men because of his righteousness. And you and I are called to share in that same kind of life. That is, we pick up our cross and follow Jesus and walk in his footsteps, that we will share in that kind of exile from the world. Jesus spoke about this in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people persecute you and insult you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. If we're going to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and live like he lived, then we're going to share in his exile. We're going to share in his rejection from the world. We're going to follow in some pretty great footsteps. Remember, Jesus went on to say in verse 12, rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We will join the company of those like Moses and Jephthah and David, who were rejected by the world for their righteousness, a righteousness ultimately personified in Jesus. Remember, Jesus told his disciples in John 15, all these things they will do to you, throw you out of the synagogues, bring you before rulers, all of these things because they don't know the one who sent me. Paul summarizes it in Romans 8, that for your sake, O Lord, we are being put to death all day long. We're considered to be like sheep to be slaughtered. That's how the world thinks of God's people. Paul quoting there from Psalm 44. And yet, like David, like Jephthah, like Moses, and ultimately like Jesus, as we are rejected by the world, we must realize that our purpose is to be salt and light. That like these great people, Jesus, of course, the greatest of all, that we are tasked with leading other people to God, to be a light to these people, that hopefully they will come out of their darkness and come out of their exile to join us in reconciliation to God. There is, of course, much more that we could say about this great biblical theme. It really does run from one end of the Bible to the other. And perhaps in some other lessons, we'll explore some other facets of this picture. But hopefully you get the picture that we're talking about here, the basic kind of contours of this picture. That the good news of the gospel is that the exile has ended, that we are being called back to God, to come out of the darkness, out of sin and death, out of hardship, and into a life of fellowship with God where there is joy and life. It is my prayer and my hope that we will all not only come out of the exile, but stay out of that exile and evermore find our place in heaven with God forever. I hope that this day finds you well, and I hope that you will be well until the time that we can meet again.